There is a legend that says gold has a heavy soul. It is said that the metal remembers the deep earth it came from, and sooner or later it will always find a way to drag itself, and anyone holding it, back down into the dark. In 1857, the United States was drunk on this metal. We built a ship of iron and steam, a floating palace designed to carry the wealth of a nation. We called her the Ship of Gold. She was the machine that promised to conquer the ocean, the Titanic of her time, an unsinkable fortress of the Gilded Age. But the ocean does not care about our banks, and the wind does not respect our engineering. When the hurricane struck, the gold in the hold didn't save the 425 souls on board. It became the anchor that drowned them. But amidst the chaos, the screaming steam and the rising water, one woman named Addie Easton found a way to survive the impossible. This is not just a story about a shipwreck. It is a story about the arrogance of an era, the collapse of an economy, and the terrifying choice between holding onto your fortune or holding onto your life. So turn down the lights, pour yourself a drink. Join me as we peel back the layers of history to descend into the eye of the storm. Let's find out what truly lies at the bottom of the Atlantic. There is a sound that wood makes when it is asked to do the impossible. It is not a snap, and it is not a groan. It is a scream, a high piercing vibration that travels through the floorboards, up through the soles of the feet, and settles in the base of the spine. It is the sound of architecture losing an argument with the ocean. Imagine the darkness, not the darkness of a bedroom with the curtains drawn, nor the darkness of a moonless country road. This is a heavy, suffocating blackness, absolute and total, broken only by the violent white froth of water crashing against glass. In this darkness, there is no horizon. There is no up, and there is no down. There is only the violent motion of the world tilting 40 degrees to the left, hanging there for a terrifying eternity, and then slamming back to the right. In the center of this chaos, amidst the roar of wind that sounds like a freight train tearing through a library, a woman is holding on to a brass railing. Her name is Addie Easton. Her knuckles are white, drained of blood, frozen in a grip so tight her fingers feel like clawed stone. She is counting. She is not counting money, though the ship beneath her is filled with it. She is not counting the miles to shore, because she knows that number is too high to matter. She is counting breaths, in and out, trying to keep the rhythm of her own lungs separate from the ragged, gasping breath of the dying ship. She is one person, just one small, fragile biology in a leviathan of iron and oak, but around her, in the cabins, in the steerage holds, in the flooded engine rooms, there are nearly 600 others. Men who dug in the dirt for years to hold a nugget of yellow metal. Fathers who promised their daughters a house in New York. Captains of industry and captains of war. By the time the sun rises on the final day, 425 of them will be gone. They will not just be dead. They will be erased, swallowed by a cold, indifferent Atlantic that does not care about their bank accounts, their prayers, or the steam engines they built to conquer it. But before the screaming starts, before the water rises, and before the history books record this as one of the greatest maritime disasters of the 19th century, there was silence. There was a calm sea. And there was a belief, an arrogant, unshakable, distinctly American belief, that we had finally built a machine that God himself could not sink. This is not a story about a storm. It is a story about the price of that belief. And it begins, as all tragedies do, with the sun shining on a quiet day. To understand why Addie Easton was standing on that deck, gripping that rail, you have to understand the world that put her there. You have to look at the map of America in the middle of the 1850s. It was a nation that felt it was expanding not just in size, but in destiny. The year is 1857. The United States is vibrating. It is a time of fever, not a fever of the blood, but of the mind. Less than a decade prior, gold had been found in the streams of California, and that discovery had sent a shockwave through the nervous system of the planet. Suddenly, the impossible distances of the continent, the prairies, the deserts, the jagged spine of the Rockies, were no longer barriers. They were simply obstacles to be monetized. New York City was exploding upwards. Banks were being built with marble pillars that looked like Greek temples, dedicated to the worship of capital. Railroads were stitching the land together with iron thread, and everywhere there was the hum of machinery. The steam engine had arrived, and with it, the promise that nature was no longer a master to be feared, but a resource to be processed. In this world, speed was the new currency. If you could move people faster, you could move money faster. If you could move money faster, you could build empires. And the vein that connected the beating heart of the East Coast banking system to the goldfields of the West was not a road. It was a shipping lane. It was a cycle, rhythmic and relentless as a heartbeat. Men went west, digging into the earth until their hands were raw. They pulled out the gold, they brought it to the coast, and then they loaded it onto the ships. These ships were not just vessels. They were the armored trucks of the 19th century. They were floating banks. Every month, millions of dollars in gold dust coins and ingots flowed from San Francisco to Panama, crossed the jungle by rail, and then boarded another steamer for New York. The economy of the entire country relied on this flow. If the ships stopped, the banks froze. If the banks froze, the factories closed. The nation was addicted to the arrival of the steamers. And because the stakes were so high, the confidence had to be absolute. You could not sell a ticket on a ship if people thought it might sink. You could not insure a crate of gold if the underwriters believed the ocean was still dangerous. So a myth was constructed. The myth was simple. We have conquered the sea. We have built ships of iron and oak, powered by engines that do not tire, driven by propellers that do not rely on the fickleness of the wind. We have beaten the Atlantic. Insurance rates dropped. Not because the ocean had become safer, the waves were just as high, the hurricanes just as violent, but because the story we told ourselves had become more convincing. We believed in the machine. We trusted the rivets. We trusted the steam pressure. We trusted the schedules printed on broadsheets in the harbor offices. It was in this atmosphere of invincible progress that the SS Central America was born. She was a beast of a ship. When she was launched, she was originally named the George Law, but history would remember her by her route, the Central America. She was 280 feet long. To the modern eye, she might look strange, a hybrid creature caught between two eras. She had 3 masts for sails, towering into the sky, webs of rigging tracing geometric patterns against the clouds. But amidst the timber and canvas, she had the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution, 2 massive steam engines, burning tons of coal a day, turning 2 side-mounted paddle wheels that churned the water with violent efficiency. She was designed for one thing, to carry heavy loads fast, but beneath the black paint and the gold leaf trim, there were choices being made, choices that were invisible to the passengers sipping brandy in the saloon, choices that were invisible to the women arranging their crinolines in the staterooms. The ship was modified. The owners, driven by the insatiable demand for capacity, looked at the blueprints and saw wasted space. Safety bulkheads, walls designed to seal off parts of the ship if water got in, were heavy. They took up room. They added weight without adding profit, and so the internal anatomy of the ship was compromised. The cargo holds were expanded. The ability to isolate a leak was sacrificed for the ability to carry more treasure. It was a calculation, a wager. They bet that the engines would always run. They bet that the pumps would always outpace the leaks. They bet that the storm would never be big enough to find the flaws they had built into the keel. And for a long time they were right. For 43 voyages, the Central America was a clockwork servant of the economy. She carried thousands of passengers. She carried letters that broke hearts and letters that built fortunes. She carried the accumulated wealth of a generation. She became known as the Ship of Gold. When she docked in New York, crowds would gather just to see her. She smelled of coal smoke, salt water, and success. To board her was to step into the future. It was to say, I am part of the modern world, and the modern world is unsinkable. On August 20th, 1857, she left New York for Aspinwall, Panama, to pick up the return leg of passengers and cargo. She sailed down the coast, a majestic silhouette against the summer sky. The crew was confident. The captain was experienced. The engines were humming. Waiting for her in Panama amidst the humidity and the noise of the port was a young woman named Addie Easton. Addie was not a tycoon. She was not a gold baron. She was, in many ways, the portrait of the ordinary American traveler. She was 35 years old, though in the daguerreotypes of the era, the hardness of life makes her look older, her eyes holding a serious, measured gaze. She was returning from California with her husband, Ansel. They were not returning defeated. They had gone west, they had worked, and they had succeeded. They were coming home to the east with the fruits of their labor, ready to start a life of comfort, perhaps even luxury. For Addie, stepping onto the Central America was the final step of a long, arduous journey. It was the victory lap. Imagine her standing on the tender boat, looking up at the black hull of the steamer rising out of the turquoise water. It must have looked like a fortress. After the dust of the mines, after the rough travel across the isthmus, the ship offered something intoxicating: civilization. She would have walked up the gangplank, her skirts rustling, perhaps holding a parasol against the tropical sun. She would have shown her ticket, a piece of paper that cost a small fortune, a piece of paper that promised her safe passage to New York. She would have been shown to a cabin, not the rough bunks of the steerage, but a proper room, a space with a door that locked, a space with a bed. She unpacked her trunk. In it were the clothes of a respectable woman, but tucked away, deeper in the luggage, or perhaps carried on her person, were the things that mattered: the profits, the gold, the future. For Addie, the ship was not just a vehicle, it was a capsule protecting her life's work. As she settled in, feeling the gentle rock of the harbor, listening to the distant shouts of the stevedores loading heavy wooden crates into the hold, she likely felt a profound sense of relief. The hard part was over. The wilderness was behind them. Now it was just a matter of days, just a simple run up the coast. She did not know that the crates being loaded below her feet contained 3 tons of gold. She did not know that the weight of that gold was making the ship sit lower in the water than the engineers had ideally intended. She did not know that the coal bunkers were being filled to capacity, adding even more weight. She only knew that the linens were clean, the food was hot, and the captain was a man named William Lewis Herndon. Captain Herndon was not a reckless man. If you look at his portrait, you see a man of discipline. He was an officer of the United States Navy, on leave to command this mail ship. He was an explorer who had mapped the Amazon. He was a man of science, a man who respected the natural world. He was the brother-in-law of Matthew Fontaine Maury, the pathfinder of the seas, the father of modern oceanography. Herndon knew the ocean. He knew the charts. He knew the currents. He was the kind of captain who checked the barometer himself. He was the kind of captain who walked the decks at night. He inspired confidence because he did not seem like a gambler. He seemed like a mathematician. When the Central America left Havana, Cuba, on September 8th, after a brief stop, Herndon had over 570 people under his care. He had a crew that was a mix of experienced sailors and rough laborers who shoveled the coal. The departure from Havana was routine. The sky was clear. The trade winds were blowing gently. The passengers crowded the rails to watch the Morro Castle fade into the distance. Cigars were lit. Drinks were poured. The paddle wheels bit into the water, churning a white wake that stretched back toward the island. But there was something happening in the atmosphere. Something that Herndon, with all his science, could not fully predict. Meteorology in 1857 was in its infancy. There were no satellites looking down from space, tracking the rotation of clouds. There was no radar. A hurricane was not a system with a name and a predicted path. A hurricane was a rumor until it was a reality. You didn't know it was coming until the barometer dropped and the sky turned a bruised purple. As the Central America steamed northward, parallel to the Florida coast, she was moving into a trap. To the east, out in the vast, unmonitored expanse of the Atlantic, warm air was rising. Cold air was rushing in to replace it. The Earth's rotation was spinning the mass. A monster was forming, a cyclone. It began as a swell. On the second day out of Havana, the rhythm of the ship changed. It wasn't the choppy bounce of coastal waters. It was a long, slow heave. The ship would rise, hang suspended, and then slide down into a trough. The horizon began to blur. The sharp line between sea and sky dissolved into a haze of grey moisture. Addie Easton would have felt this change in her cabin. The hairbrushes on her vanity would have started to slide. The hanging oil lamp would have begun a slow, mesmerizing swing, pendulum. Tick-tock. On the bridge, Captain Herndon watched the glass. The barometer was falling, not plummeting, not yet, but sliding downward with a steady persistence. He spoke with his engineers. They had plenty of coal, the engines were strong. The standard procedure for a steamship in rough weather was to power through. A sailing ship might have to run before the wind, might have to surrender to the direction of the storm. But a steamship had a heart of fire. It could drive straight into the teeth of the gale. They made a decision. It was the decision of the era. You keep going. To turn back to Havana would be a delay. It would cost money. It would look weak. To turn east would be to head into the unknown, so they held the course. North, straight up the Gulf Stream. They did not know they were sailing directly into the eye of a hurricane that would later be classified as a Category 2. By the afternoon of September 11th, the world had changed. The sun was gone. The sky was a low, oppressive ceiling of racing grey clouds. The wind had stiffened from a breeze to a gale, whistling through the rigging with a sound like a whip cracking. The passengers were no longer on deck. They had retreated to the salons and the cabins. The mood shifted from festive to endure. Conversations became quieter. People held onto their teacups with both hands. Below decks, in the hot, dark caverns of the engine room, the reality was more physical. The firemen, stripped to the waist, covered in coal dust and sweat, were fighting to keep their footing. The floor was tilting violently. They had to time their shovels, throwing the coal into the furnaces when the ship leveled out. And then the first sign of the true horror appeared. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't an explosion. It was much smaller, much more insidious. Water. It appeared in the bilges. This was not unusual. Wooden ships leak. The twisting and hogging of the hull in heavy seas opens the seams. That is why ships have pumps. But this water was different. It was rising. The chief engineer watched the gauges. He ordered the pumps to be engaged. The great mechanical hearts of the ship began to suck the water out, spewing it back into the sea. For a moment it seemed under control, but the storm was not just wind and wave, it was chaos. As the ship rolled, the coal in the bunkers, hundreds of tons of loose rock, began to shift. It slid to one side, then the other. And then it didn't slide back. The ship developed a list, a lean. She was tilting permanently to starboard. This list was a catastrophe. Because of the tilt, the water in the bilge didn't flow evenly to the pumps. It pooled on the low side, and on the low side the coal bunkers were open. The water sloshed into the coal. It washed the coal dust down into the bilges. A thick, black sludge began to form. It was like mud. It flowed toward the intakes of the pumps. The strain on the machine increased. The pumps sucked at the sludge, choked and slowed. Captain Herndon was called below. He stood in the deafening noise of the engine room, watching the water rise around the ankles of the firemen. He saw the problem immediately. If the water rose high enough, it would reach the fires. If the water reached the fires, the steam would die. If the steam died, the paddle wheels would stop, and if the paddle wheels stopped, the Central America would no longer be a machine. She would just be a heavy iron bucket, filled with gold, drifting sideways in a hurricane. Herndon went back to the deck. The wind was now so strong it was difficult to stand. The spray was stripping the paint from the wood. He looked out at the ocean, which was now a landscape of moving mountains, waves 30, 40 feet high, white-capped and furious. He realized then that the technology had failed. The promise of the steam engine, the promise of the schedule, the promise of the insurance companies, it was all dissolving. He ordered the sails to be set, hoping to keep the ship's head into the wind if the engines failed. But the wind was too strong. The canvas shredded instantly, blowing away like wet tissue paper. The ship fell into the trough of the waves. She turned broadside. This is the death roll. When a ship is broadside, the waves do not cut the bow. They smash the entire length of the hull. They roll the ship over. Inside the cabins, Addie Easton felt the change. The rhythmic pitching was gone. Now there was a sickening, lurching roll. Furniture began to slide across the room. A trunk slammed into a wall. A pitcher of water shattered. She didn't scream, not yet. She sat on the edge of her bunk, holding onto the frame. She looked at her husband. They didn't need to speak. The sound of the storm outside was speaking for them. The sound of the wind was no longer a whistle. It was a roar, a continuous deafening roar that vibrated the teeth in their skulls. Below them, the water touched the grates of the furnaces. There was a hiss of steam. A cloud of white vapor filled the engine room. One by one, the fires were extinguished. The great pistons, which had been driving them toward New York, slowed. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Silence. The heartbeat of the Central America stopped. Now there was only the storm and the people. The lights flickered and dimmed as the pressure dropped. The ship was plunged into a gloom that was almost total darkness. In the saloon, the stewards tried to maintain order. They lit candles. The small, flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that swayed violently with every roll of the dying ship. The passengers gathered. The class divides began to dissolve. The banker stood next to the miner. The velvet dress brushed against the rough wool coat. They were all just weight now, ballast in a sinking vessel. Addie made her way to the main cabin. She saw men crying. She saw men praying. She saw a group of gamblers who had been playing cards an hour before, sitting in silence. The cards scattered on the floor like fallen leaves. Captain Herndon entered the room. He was wet, his uniform sodden, his face grave. He did not lie to them. He did not tell them it was a minor technical difficulty. He told them the truth, or at least as much of the truth as they could handle. The engines are down, the ship is taking on water, we are in a hurricane. He asked for volunteers. He needed men to form a bucket brigade. Since the mechanical pumps were failing, they would have to use human muscle. They would have to bail out the Atlantic Ocean, one bucket at a time. It was a ludicrous, impossible task, but it was something to do. It was better than waiting. Dozens of men stepped forward. They formed lines stretching from the depths of the engine room up the stairs to the deck. They passed buckets, leather buckets, canvas buckets, cooking pots, anything that could hold water. Addie watched them. She watched the desperation in their movements, the rhythmic grunt of effort. Heave, pass, heave, pass. For hours they worked. The water was cold. It was oily. It smelled of sulfur and fear. But for every bucket they threw over the side, the ocean threw 1,000 tons back. The leak was growing. The hull was groaning. The ship settled lower. The list to starboard became steeper. Walking across the room became a climb. Addie returned to her cabin. She looked at the small trunk that held their fortune. The gold. The metal that had driven them across a continent. The metal that had built the cities and the railroads. It sat there, heavy and inert. She realized, with a cold clarity, that the gold was not going to save them. In fact, it was the gold that was killing them. It was the weight of the treasure hidden in the bowels of the ship that was dragging them down. She opened a small locket she wore around her neck. Inside might have been a picture of a mother or a child left behind, a small sentimental anchor to the world of the living. She closed it. She took off her shoes. She prepared herself for the water. Outside the sun went down and the true night began. The storm did not rest. It grew. The wind speed increased. The waves grew steeper. The Central America was a wounded animal, bleeding coal and steam into the raging dark. And she was all alone. There were no flares to see, no other ships on the horizon, just the vast, empty, screaming Atlantic. And the water kept rising. To understand what is about to be lost, you must first understand the rhythm of the thing that is living. Before the water rises above the floorboards, a ship like the Central America is not just a vehicle. It is a city. It is a floating geography of class, ambition, and routine. For the first few days of the voyage, the ship functioned as a perfect microcosm of the American experiment. On the upper decks in the first-class saloons, the air smelled of beeswax polish and expensive tobacco. Men in frock coats discussed the price of land in San Francisco. They leaned back in velvet chairs, swirling brandy in crystal glasses, debating the expansion of the railroads. They were the winners of the gold rush, the men who had turned dust into dynasties. Below them in the second class were the strivers, the shopkeepers, the clerks, the families returning east with enough savings to buy a farm or start a business. They ate at long communal tables. Their conversations were louder, more urgent. They talked about the future with the nervous energy of people who had just barely made it. And at the bottom, in the steerage, In the cramped, dimly lit spaces near the waterline were the labourers, the men who had swung the pickaxes, the men who had washed the gravel. They slept in bunks stacked 3 high. The air down there was thick with the smell of unwashed wool and damp coal. They didn't talk about dynasties. They talked about survival. They played dice. They prayed. But regardless of the ticket price, every single person on that ship was united by one invisible fact. They were floating on top of a fortune. The gold was everywhere. It was in the official shipment in the strong room, tons of it, stacked in heavy wooden boxes stamped with the seals of banks like Wells Fargo. But it was also in the pockets of the passengers. It was sewn into the linings of coats. It was hidden in hollowed-out books. It was worn in heavy belts around waists chafing the skin. There was so much gold on board that the crew joked the ship sat lower in the water simply because of the greed. They called her the Golden Ship. But gold is heavy. It is dense. It is a metal that wants to return to the earth. It pulls downward. In the routine of the voyage, this weight was forgotten. The days were marked by the ringing of the bell. Breakfast at 8, inspection at 10, dinner at 6. The steam whistle blew at noon to mark the time. It was a world of order, a world where nature was kept behind thick glass portholes, a scenic backdrop to the serious business of civilization. But the ocean has a way of dismantling order. It does not care about schedules. It does not care about the net worth of the passengers. It only cares about physics. And on Friday, the physics changed. The wind found its voice. It began as a low moan in the rigging, a sound like a bow drawn across a cello string, constant and unnerving. Then it sharpened. It became a shriek. The whitecaps on the waves were no longer just foam. They were sheets of spray, torn from the surface and hurled horizontally like buckshot. The Central America was a hybrid creature, steam and sail. In moderate weather, the sails helped the engines. They captured the wind and eased the burden on the coal. But in a hurricane, sails are a liability. They are great white hands that grab the wind and try to throw the ship over. The crew fought to furl them. Men climbed the rigging, clinging to wet ropes 50 feet above the heaving deck. The wind tried to peel them off the spars. The canvas, usually soft and pliable, was stiff with water and hard as plywood. It whipped and snapped with the force of a cannon shot. One by one the sails blew out. They didn't just tear, they exploded, shredding into tatters that streamed from the yards like surrender flags. Now the ship was naked. It was stripped of its ability to use the wind. It had to fight it. Captain Herndon stood on the bridge. He was a man of the Navy, trained in the logic of command. He looked at the sea, which was building into hills and valleys of terrifying scale. He knew the doctrine. Keep the bow into the wind. If you let the storm hit you from the side, you roll. If you roll too far, you capsize. So he gave the order that would seal their fate, though he could not have known it at the time. He ordered the engines to full power. Drive into it. The great paddle wheels thrashed. They bit into the oncoming walls of water, churning and straining. The ship would climb a wave, the bow pointing at the sky, the engines groaning as the propellers lifted out of the water and spun freely in the air. A sound like a buzzsaw screaming. Then the ship would slam down, burying her nose in the trough, shuddering from stem to stern. This battle required energy, massive amounts of it. Down in the bunkers, the coal was disappearing. The firemen were shoveling with a frantic rhythm. They were feeding the beast. But the beast was hungry. The more the wind pushed back, the more coal they had to burn just to stay in one place. The ship was not moving forward anymore. It was running a marathon on a treadmill, burning its own lifeblood just to keep from being thrown backward. And then the balance tipped. It started with a subtle shift in the sensation of the deck, a heaviness, a lethargy. When the ship rolled to the right, it didn't snap back as quickly as it should have. It hung there, it hesitated. The crew felt it first. Sailors know the feel of a ship through the soles of their boots. They looked at each other. They knew what that sluggishness meant. Water weight. The leak had begun. It was small at first, perhaps a seam opened by the violent twisting of the hull. But water is patient. It found the gaps. It trickled down through the ribs of the ship, past the cargo holds, past the gold, down into the deepest, darkest part of the vessel. The bilges. In the engine room, the war was no longer metaphoric. It was physical. The engineers were working in a hellscape. The air was a scalding mix of steam, coal dust, and sulfur. The noise was deafening. The roar of the furnaces, the clanking of the pistons, the thunder of the waves against the hull. And now the water was rising around their boots. It wasn't clean ocean water. It was black sludge. As the ship tossed, the loose coal in the bunkers had washed down into the bilge. It mixed with the water to create a thick, gritty slurry. The pumps were designed for water. They were not designed for mud. The intake valves clogged. The pumps wheezed and strained. The engineers dove into the black water, holding their breath, trying to clear the grates with their bare hands. They came up gasping, covered in grease, their eyes wide with panic. They cleared one grate and 5 seconds later it was clogged again. The water kept rising. It crept up the bulkheads. It reached the ash pits beneath the boilers. When cold water hits hot ash, it creates steam. Clouds of choking white vapor filled the room. The firemen couldn't see what they were doing. They were shoveling by feel, waist deep in a toxic soup, trying to feed fires that were being strangled from below. And then the inevitable happened. The water touched the fire bars. A hiss, a sputter. The roar of the furnaces died down to a flicker. The steam pressure gauge on the wall, the clock that measured the ship's heartbeat, began to unwind. The needle dropped. Above decks, the rhythmic thumping of the paddle wheels slowed. Thump, thump, thump. And then silence. The machine had failed. The triumph of the industrial age, the iron conqueror of the Atlantic, was dead. The Central America was no longer a steamship. She was a drifting hulk. In the passenger cabins, the silence of the engines was more terrifying than the noise of the storm. When the engines were running, there was hope. There was a sense of agency. We are doing something, we are fighting. But when the vibration stopped, reality crashed in. The ship immediately fell off the wind. Without the forward drive to keep her nose straight, the wind grabbed the bow and swung it around. She turned broadside to the waves, the trough of the sea. It is a nautical term for the valley between two waves. To be caught there, broadside, is to be helpless. The ship began to roll. Not the gentle sway of a cruise, but violent, sickening lurches. 30 degrees, 40 degrees. The horizon would disappear, replaced by a wall of green water towering above the deck. Then the ship would be picked up, tossed to the crest, and slammed down again. Inside the staterooms, the world disintegrated. Addie Easton was in her cabin. She was a woman of composure, raised to keep her emotions private. But there is no etiquette for a hurricane. The room tilted. Her trunk slid across the floor and smashed into the door. The wash basin flew off its stand, shattering against the wall. The oil lamp swung so violently it hit the ceiling, showering the room with glass and oil. She grabbed the bedpost. Her muscles screamed with the effort of holding on. Beside her, her husband, Ansel, was trying to secure their belongings. But what was the point? From the corridor, she heard sounds that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The screams of children, the shouting of men, the splintering of wood. She opened the door and looked out. The hallway was a funnel of chaos. Passengers were being thrown against the walls like dolls. A woman slid past, clutching a Bible, her eyes squeezed shut. A steward tried to walk, bracing himself against the ceiling, his face a mask of terror. Addie saw a man lose his grip and slide down the tilted floor, crashing into a heap of luggage. She didn't think. She reached out. She grabbed his coat as he tumbled past. She hauled him to a stop. In that moment, she wasn't a passenger, she wasn't a lady. She was a human being in a collapsing world. She looked down at her feet. She was wearing her boots, sturdy leather boots with buttons. They were heavy, they were slippery on the wet wood. She made a choice. She sat down on the floor, amidst the broken glass and the sliding furniture, and she unbuttoned them. She pulled them off. She stood up in her stocking feet. She felt the vibration of the floor, the cold dampness of the wood. She was lighter now. She was ready to move. She was ready to swim. It was a small act, but it was an admission. The boots belonged to the world of land. They belonged to sidewalks and carriages. They had no place here. By taking them off, she was accepting that the ship was no longer a piece of land. It was becoming part of the sea. In the main saloon, the scene was biblical. The furniture had been bolted down, but the bolts were snapping. Heavy mahogany tables were tearing loose, sliding back and forth like battering rams. People were huddled in the corners, trying to stay out of the path of the crushing wood. Captain Herndon appeared. He was no longer the distant authority figure on the bridge. He was among them. He looked exhausted. His uniform was soaked. He had not slept in 2 days. He climbed onto a table that was still secured. He raised his hand. "The pumps have failed," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried over the roar of the storm. "The water is rising. We cannot restart the fires." A gasp went through the room, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the space. "But we are not dead yet," Herndon continued. "We can bail. We can fight. I need every man who can lift a bucket. I need every man who wants to see New York again." It was a rally cry, but it was also a confession. The technology was gone. The science was gone. All that was left was flesh and bone. The men stood up. Bankers, lawyers, miners. They stripped off their coats. They rolled up their sleeves. They formed a line, a bucket brigade. It is an ancient, primitive thing. A line of men passing water from hand to hand. It belongs to the Middle Ages, not the Industrial Revolution. But here they were in 1857 on the most advanced ship of their time, reverting to the most basic form of survival. They worked. They passed buckets from the flooded steerage up the stairs out to the deck. They bailed for hours. Their backs screamed. Their hands blistered. They sang songs to keep the rhythm. Old Dan Tucker, the Star-Spangled Banner. But the ocean was infinite, and the buckets were small. For every gallon they threw over the side, the sea pushed 10 gallons back through the leaks. The water level in the hold didn't drop, it rose, and then the lights went out. The ship's gas lamps flickered and died. The darkness was absolute. Addie sat in the corner of the saloon, huddled with the other women. They held each other, strangers embracing like sisters. In the dark, you couldn't see the fear on their faces, but you could feel the trembling of their bodies. They listened to the sounds of the ship dying, the groan of the iron frames, the creak of the wood, the slosh of the water rising below them. And then, a new sound, a sharp cracking sound from the deck above. The captain had ordered the masts to be cut away. To reduce the weight aloft, to stop the wind from leveraging the ship over, they were chopping down the masts. Crack, crash. The giant timbers fell into the sea. The ship shuddered. It didn't help. The list worsened. The deck was now tilted at such a steep angle that you couldn't stand without holding on. Addie looked at the window. Outside, it was black. But every few seconds, a flash of lightning would illuminate the world. She saw the waves. They were higher than the ship. They were mountains of water curling and breaking, ready to swallow them whole. She realized then that hope was a cruel thing. It made you wait. It made you suffer. She touched the pocket of her dress, the gold coins she had sewn there. They felt cold. They felt like stones. She thought of the life she was supposed to have, the house with the garden, the children she would raise, the quiet Sunday afternoons. It all seemed very far away, as distant as the moon. Here, in the dark, tilting saloon of the Central America, there was only the sound of the water, rising, 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 and the silence of the engines which would never start again. There is a specific kind of darkness that only exists in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean when the moon is hidden. It is not just the absence of light, it is the absence of geometry. In a city, even in the darkest alley, there are walls, corners, hard lines that define where the world begins and ends. But on the night of Saturday, September 12th, the world had lost its edges. There was no horizon. The sky and the sea had welded themselves together into a single suffocating sphere of black, violent noise. Inside the main cabin of the Central America, the air was foul. It had been used and reused by hundreds of lungs. It smelled of fear, of sweat, and of the sour metallic tang of vomit. The candles had long since burned down or been extinguished to save oxygen. The only light came from the occasional terrifying flash of lightning that turned the room into a strobe-lit photograph of despair. In these flashes you would have seen a strange activity. People were writing. They were not writing journals. They were not writing poetry. They were writing their last wills and testaments. Men who had spent years fighting the earth for gold were now using their final moments of dexterity to scribble on scraps of paper, on the backs of envelopes, on torn pages of books. My darling wife, the storm is bad. I do not think we will make it. Mother, tell the boys I thought of them. Addie Easton sat on the floor, braced against the slant of the deck. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could not hold a pencil. She watched her husband, Ansel. He was calm, or perhaps he was just frozen. He was trying to secure a belt of gold dust around his waist, a futile gesture, a habit of the land. She wanted to write a name, she wanted to leave a mark. But the ship shuddered, a long, groaning vibration that felt like the keel was being dragged over gravel. The pen slipped. The paper remained blank. She realized then that she would leave no words. If she died here, she would simply vanish. The ocean does not keep archives. Dawn broke, but it brought no relief. The sun did not rise. The grey merely intensified. The light revealed the wreckage. The Central America was a ruin. The masts were gone, hacked away. The deck was a tangle of ropes and splintered wood, and she was sitting dangerously low. The waves were no longer hitting the hull. They were rolling over the deck, washing around the skylights. But then, a cry went up. A ragged, desperate shout from the lookout. "Sail! Sail, ho!" It seemed impossible, a hallucination conjured by 500 praying minds. But there in the lifting grey mist was a shape. It was small, tossing like a cork, but it was a ship. It was the brig Marine, a tiny vessel barely 100 feet long. It had been battered by the same storm. Its own masts were damaged, it was leaking, but it was there. The captain of the Marine, a man named Hiram Burt, saw the drifting Leviathan. He saw the American flag flying upside down, the universal signal of distress. He made a decision that defies the logic of self-preservation. He did not run. He hove to. He turned his small, wounded ship into the wind and tried to hold a position near the dying steamer. But the ocean between them was a killing field. The waves were still 20 feet high. To bring the ships side by side was impossible. They would smash each other to pieces. There was only one way. Lifeboats. The Central America had lifeboats, but not enough. And of the ones she had, some had been smashed by the storm, and others were rusted into their davits. They managed to launch three small, fragile wooden shells to save 575 people. Captain Herndon stood on the quarterdeck. He held a speaking trumpet. His voice was hoarse, but his orders were absolute. He did not consult a rule book. He consulted the ancient, unwritten constitution of the sea. Women and children first. It is a phrase we have heard so many times it has lost its weight. We think of it as a polite custom, like holding a door open. But on a sinking ship, it is a sentence. It is a mathematical equation where the variables are human lives. For every woman who stepped forward, a man had to step back. For every child lifted into a boat, a father had to let go of a hand. The scene on the deck was a chaotic, agonizing sorting process. The men formed lines. They did not riot. They did not rush the boats. There was a stoic, Victorian discipline that held them in place. They stood back, water swirling around their boots, and watched their families leave. Addie stood by the rail. The boat was bobbing violently in the water below, rising and falling 10 feet with every swell. To get into it, she couldn't just step. She had to be lowered. A boatswain's chair, a simple loop of rope and canvas, was rigged from a crane. She looked at Ansel. This was the moment, the cleavage. There was no time for a long speech. No time to recap the years of their marriage, the struggle of the gold fields, the dreams of the house in New York. There was only the wet wind and the shouting of the sailors. "Go," he said. "I will come in the next boat." It was a lie. They both knew it. The Marine was small. The daylight was fading. The Central America was groaning. Addie climbed into the rope sling. She was swinging out over the abyss. She was clutching a small bag, a reticule. Inside it were items of value. Not just money, but memory. A daguerreotype, a piece of jewelry. It didn't matter, it was a piece of her life. As the sailors lowered her, The ship lurched, the rope twisted. She swung hard against the iron side of the hull, the bag snagged on a cleat or a piece of torn railing. For a second she was suspended, caught between the ship and the sea. The sailors below in the lifeboat were screaming at her. "Let go! You must let go!" If she tried to save the bag, she would be crushed against the hull when the next wave hit. If she held on to the past, she would die with it. Her fingers opened. The bag fell. It disappeared into the white foam. She fell into the arms of the sailors in the lifeboat. She hit the bottom of the boat hard, bruising her ribs. She looked up. High above, looking over the rail, was Ansel. He was already a silhouette against the grey sky. He raised a hand. Then the boat pushed off, and the distance began to open. The journey to the marine was a nightmare in miniature. The lifeboat was overloaded. It sat so low in the water that waves constantly broke over the gunwales. The women bailed with their bonnets. They bailed with their hands. When they reached the marine, there was no ladder. The sea was tossing the small brig so violently that to get aboard the women had to wait for the lifeboat to rise on a crest, then be grabbed by men on the deck and hauled over the rail like sacks of flour. Addie was pulled onto the deck of the marine. She collapsed on the wet planks. She was safe, but safety is a relative term. She stood up and looked back. The Central America was a tragedy of scale. From this distance she could see the list clearly. The ship was leaning so far over that the yards were almost touching the water. She looked like a great beast kneeling to drink, and she was heavy, so heavy. The gold. Deep in the hold, the 3 tons of bullion, the boxes of double eagles, the ingots. They were doing their work. They were not currency anymore. They were ballast. They were dragging the ship down with the relentless pull of gravity. The ambition that had built the ship was now the anchor drowning it. Night fell. A darkness even deeper than the night before. The marine had drifted miles away. The storm had blown them apart. Addie stood at the rail of the rescue ship, staring into the black void. She was looking for a light, a lantern, a signal. On the Central America, the end was arriving. The water had reached the saloon. The men who remained, more than 400 of them, had moved to the highest point of the ship, the port side. They were clustered there, a mass of humanity clinging to the rigging, to the rails, to each other. Captain Herndon was among them. He had gone to his cabin and put on his full dress uniform. He took off the oilskin cover from his cap. If he was going to meet the ocean, he would do it as an officer of the United States Navy. He gave his watch to a passenger who was getting into the last boat. He gave his heart to his wife in a silent prayer. At 8 o'clock a rocket was fired. A streak of red fire tore through the night. A brief bloody scar against the clouds. It was the signal that the end was now. The ship didn't just sink, it broke. The structural stress of the list, combined with the weight of the water and the gold, snapped the iron frames. There was a sound that survivors described as the earth splitting open, a screech of tearing metal that drowned out the wind. The bow rose up, vertical, like a tombstone. The stern, weighed down by the flooded engines and the gold, dragged backwards. And then, the suction. When a ship of that size leaves the surface, it creates a hole in the ocean, a vortex. The water rushes in to fill the space. Addie, miles away on the marine, heard nothing. The storm swallowed the sound. She only saw the single, tiny light of the steamer's masthead lamp. She watched it bob in the darkness. And then, in an instant, it blinked out. There was no flicker, no fade, just existence, and then non-existence. On the surface of the ocean, where the ship had been, there was a moment of absolute chaos. 400 men were pulled down by the suction. They were tumbled in the vortex, spun around in the black water, their lungs burning, their ears popping from the pressure. Those who were strong, those who were lucky, fought their way back to the surface. They popped up into a world of debris, doors, crates, spars, pieces of the deck. The ocean was covered in the flotsam of the wreck. And then the sound changed. It was no longer the mechanical sound of the ship. It was a human sound. Voices, hundreds of them, calling out, screaming names, praying, "God help me! Mary, yo, over here!" It was a chorus of the damned rising from the waves. Addie Easton could not hear them. On the marine, the wind howled through the rigging, but in her mind the silence was louder. She stood at the rail, soaking wet, shivering, staring at the spot where the light had vanished. She was surrounded by other survivors, women weeping, children crying for fathers who would never come. But she felt a profound, singular isolation. She was floating on a chip of wood in a universe that had just proven it did not care about her love, her future, or her gold. She called out under her breath, "Ansel." The wind took the name and tore it away. No one answered. The ocean rolled on, heavy and black, hiding its new wealth. 3 tons of gold, 425 bodies, and the wreck of the machine that was supposed to be unsinkable. The storm raged through the night, indifferent to the fact that it had just concluded one of the greatest tragedies of the age. And Addie Easton waited for a morning that would bring light but no brightness. The sun that rose on Sunday morning was indifferent. It painted the Atlantic in soft pinks and bruised purples, casting a beautiful, serene light over a graveyard. The storm had passed. The wind had dropped to a whisper. The waves, which hours before had been mountains, were now just rolling hills, gentle and rhythmic. If you were a seabird flying over the coordinates where the Central America had been, you would not see a ship. You would see a scar on the water, a debris field stretching for miles. Shattered timber, crates of mail, velvet cushions from the saloon, and bodies, hundreds of them, floating in life jackets that had failed, or clinging to pieces of wreckage. But amidst the silence of the dead there was still the gasping of the living. Scattered across the ocean surface were small constellations of survivors. Men clinging to doors, men holding onto hatch covers. They had been in the water for 8, 9, 10 hours. Their skin was bleached white by the salt. Their minds were drifting into hypothermia. They were no longer bankers or miners. They were biological organisms fighting the urge to sleep. Among them, floating on a piece of wooden grating, was Ansel Easton. He had watched the ship go down. He had felt the suction. He had been pulled into the darkness and spat back out. Now he was alone. He believed his wife was safe on the marine, but he also knew the marine was damaged. He did not know if she was alive. She did not know if he was alive. They were separated by miles of water and the thick silence of the aftermath. Then a shape on the horizon. Not a hallucination this time. As Norwegian bark, the Ellen. She was sailing through the wreckage, her crew lining the rails, staring in horror at the sea of heads bobbing in the swell. They began to pull men from the water. It was slow work. The survivors were too weak to climb ropes. They had to be hoisted like wet cargo. 50 men were plucked from the ocean that morning, 50 out of the hundreds who had gone into the water. Ansel Easton was one of them. When he was pulled onto the deck of the Ellen, he collapsed. He was alive, but he was bankrupt of everything but his breath. The gold he had carried, the wealth he had secured for his family, it was gone. Spiraling down into the crushing dark, settling into the silt 1.5 miles below. While the survivors shivered in blankets, the shockwave of the disaster was already traveling toward land. But it wasn't traveling by ship, it was traveling by the absence of one. In New York City, the mood was brittle. The banks were already trembling. The economy had overextended itself. Railroad bonds were failing. Credit was drying up. The entire financial system was holding its breath, waiting for the Central America. She was carrying the lifeline, 3 tons of California gold, enough specie to back the banks, to settle the debts, to calm the panic. Men stood on the docks at South Street Seaport, looking through spyglasses. They checked their pocket watches. Tuesday came and went. Wednesday, Thursday. The horizon remained empty. When the news finally broke, carried by the rescue ships that limped into port days later, it did not just break hearts. It broke the spine of the American economy. The headlines screamed, "The Central America lost." But the subtext was colder. The gold is gone. The effect was instantaneous. The panic of 1857 detonated. Banks in New York suspended specie payments. They closed their doors. Factories shut down. Railroad construction stopped. The loss of that single ship acted as the final domino in a chain reaction that plunged the United States into a deep depression. People lost their savings. Families were thrown onto the street. The confidence that had built the steamships, the arrogance that had said, "We have conquered the nature of risk," evaporated overnight. And in the middle of this national collapse, a smaller, quieter drama was playing out. Addie Easton arrived in Norfolk, Virginia. She stepped off the rescue ship into a world that looked the same, but felt alien. She was wearing borrowed clothes. She had no luggage. She had no gold. She moved through the crowds of weeping women, the wives and mothers scanning the lists of the dead. She carried a heavy certainty in her chest. She was a widow. She had seen the ship go down. She knew the mathematics of the ocean. She prepared herself for a life alone, a life of quiet grief. But the ocean is a place of strange accounting. It takes, but occasionally, capriciously, it returns. 9 days after the sinking, the bark Ellen docked. The telegraph wires hummed with a new list of names, the saved, and there, written in the ink of a clerk's ledger, was the name A. Easton. The reunion of Addie and Ansel is a scene that belongs to fiction, but it belongs to history. When they found each other, it was not a triumph. It was a collision of two people who had seen the other side of the grave. They held each other, not with the joy of a wedding day, but with the desperate, clawing grip of survivors. They were the exceptions. They were the anomaly. For 425 other families, there was no reunion. There were only the empty hooks in the hallway where coats used to hang. There were only the debts that could not be paid. The Central America faded from the headlines. The Civil War arrived 4 years later, washing over the memory of the shipwreck with a tide of blood that made the loss of 500 men seem, tragically, like a statistic. The ship became a ghost story. Then it became a footnote. But the gold did not disappear. Gold is patient. It does not rust. It does not decay. It sits in the darkness, waiting. For 130 years, the wreck lay in the midnight zone, 8,000 feet down. The pressure there is immense, hundreds of atmospheres. The iron hull of the ship slowly corroded. The wood was eaten by worms. The grand staircase, the velvet curtains, the captain's charts, they all disintegrated into sludge. But the gold remained. In the late 1980s, the machine returned to the scene of the crime. This time, it was not a steam engine but a robot, a remote-operated vehicle, equipped with cameras and claws, descending through the water column on a tether of fiber optics. When the lights of the submersible swept over the debris field, the operators in the control room above stopped breathing. It looked like a fairy tale. The iron was gone, turned to rusticles and orange dust, but sitting on the bottom, shining as brightly as the day it was minted, was the treasure. It was spread out like a carpet. Thousands of gold coins, double eagles, bars of bullion stacked like bricks. The Garden of Gold, they called it. The camera zoomed in. There were stacks of coins that had been in wooden boxes. The wood had rotted away entirely, leaving the towers of gold standing naked and defiant against the current. It was beautiful, and it was horrifying, because mixed in with that gold, hidden in the sediment, were the other remnants, a pair of spectacles, a glass bottle with the cork still in it, a daguerreotype frame, the image long since washed away by the salt. The salvage team brought the gold up, millions of dollars worth. It was cleaned, catalogued, and put on display. People lined up to see it. They stared at the shiny metal, mesmerized by its purity. But if you looked closely at the ingots, you could see the truth. The gold was heavy. It was the heaviest thing on the ship. When the Central America began to die, when the water rose and the buoyancy failed, it was this metal that acted as the anchor. The passengers had worked for it. They had prayed for it. And in the end, it was the thing that held the ship down long enough for the sea to claim it. Addie Easton lived the rest of her life on land. She and Ansel rebuilt. They had children. They grew old. But it is said that Addie never again looked at the ocean with trust. She knew what lay beneath the surface. She knew that the line between a miracle and a tragedy is as thin as a plating of iron. The story of the Central America is often told as a treasure hunt. It is told as a story of lost millions found by clever science. But that is the wrong story. This is a story about the contract we sign with technology. We build machines to outrun nature. We build engines to ignore the wind. We build hulls to deny the water. And we insure it all, convinced that we have calculated the risk. But the ocean keeps its own books, and its currency is not gold. The wreck still sits there, what's left of it. The gold is mostly gone now, brought back to the surface to be sold at auction. But the shadows remain. In the end, Addie Easton survived not because of the machine, but because she knew when to abandon it. She survived because she let go of the heavy things. She took off her boots, she dropped her bag. She stepped into the dark air and trusted the water more than the iron. Most of us are still on the ship. We are still trusting the engines. We are still counting the gold in the hold, sure that the storm will pass, sure that the pumps will hold, sure that we are unsinkable. But the wind is rising, the barometer is falling, and the ocean is waiting.